Hello, this is Tony Hiller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. Over the last dozen years, I've seen some pretty impressive propaganda pieces put out by the press. But the latest one from Seth Borenstein, published in the LA Times, is probably the best one I've seen so far. This article is so full of junk science and misinformation that I'm going to have to walk through it line by line. LA Times, August 20th, 2019. Greenland's glaciers are melting. It's as if Earth's refrigerator door were left open. By Seth Borenstein. Helheim Glacier, Greenland. This is where Earth's refrigerator door is left open, where glaciers dwindle and seas begin to rise. New York University air and ocean scientist David Holland, who's been tracking Greenland from above and below, calls it the end of the planet. He's referring to geography, not making an apocalyptic prediction. Yet in many ways, the spot just inside the Arctic Circle is where the planet's warmer and watery future is being written. It's so warm here that on an August day, coats are left on the ground and Holland and colleagues work on the watery melting ice without gloves. In one of the closest towns, Kulusuk, the morning temperature reached 52 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough for shirt sleeves. The ice Holland is standing on is thousands of years old. Scientists say it will be gone within a year or two, adding yet more water to rising seas worldwide. Summer this year is hitting Greenland hard with record-shattering heat and extreme melt. By season's end, about 440 billion tons of ice, maybe more, will have melted or calved off Greenland's giant ice sheet, experts estimate. That's enough to flood the entire state of Pennsylvania underwater about a foot deep. Between July 31st and August 3rd alone, more than 58 billion tons melted from the surface. The average for this time of year is less than 18 billion tons, and that doesn't even count the huge calving events or the warm water eating away at the glaciers from below. One of the places hit hardest this hot Greenland summer is on the southeastern edge of the giant frozen island. Helheim, one of Greenland's fastest retreating glaciers, has shrunk about 6 miles since scientists came here in 2005. Several scientists, such as oceanographer Josh Willis of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, said what's happening is a result of both man-made climate change and natural but weird weather patterns. Glaciers here do shrink in the summer and grow in the winter, but nothing like this year. Summit Station, a research camp nearly 2 miles high and far north, warmed to above freezing twice this year for a record total of 16.5 hours. Before this year, that station was above zero for only 6.5 hours in 2012, once in 1889, and also in the Middle Ages. If you look at climate model projections, we can expect to see larger areas of the ice sheet experiencing melt for longer durations of the year and greater mass loss going forward, said University of Georgia ice scientist Tom Mote. There's every reason to believe that years like this will become more common. Well, Seth Borenstein and the LA Times have given me enough material to make a feature-length film, but I'm going to keep this as short as possible. Let's start at the beginning. This is where Earth's refrigerator door is left open, where glaciers dwindle and seas begin to rise. Let's focus on the part where he says glaciers dwindle and seas begin to rise. This is a graph of sea level over the last 20,000 years since the end of the last ice age. 20,000 years ago, sea level was about 400 feet or 120 meters lower than it is now. From about 16,000 years ago until about 8,000 years ago, sea level rose very quickly. But over the past 8,000 years, it's been rising much more slowly, and it's hardly rising at all now. But Seth Borenstein wants you to believe that sea level rise is something new and that it's caused by humans. So I annotated the graph with his propaganda. Climate alarmists want you to believe that the 400 feet of sea level rise which occurred over the last 20,000 years is natural, but the recent tiny little bit of sea level rise is man-made. This idea is completely nonsensical, and the only way they can keep propagating is keeping the public ignorant about history. And I have to ask, why do all these scientists quoted in the article seem to want to keep the public ignorant? Now let's go back to the article. New York University air and ocean scientist David Holland, who's been tracking Greenland from above and below, calls it the end of the planet. He's referring to geography, not making an apocalyptic prediction. Yet in many ways, the spot just inside the Arctic Circle is where the planet's warmer and watery future is being written. So let's look at what Borenstein did there. He said that David Holland was not making an apocalyptic prediction, so Borenstein made it for him. Borenstein is saying that he knows what the future of the planet is and it's apocalyptic. Now, if I was David Holland, I'd be pretty upset about him twisting my words like that. Now let's go to the next paragraph. It's so warm here that on an August day, coats are left on the ground and Holland and colleagues work on the watery melting ice without gloves. In one of the closest towns, Kulisuk, the morning temperature reached 52 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough for shirt sleeves. So Borenstein wants you to believe that this sort of weather is really unusual. Let's take a look at the historical record and see if 52 degrees is actually an unusual temperature for that part of Greenland. This is the part of southeast Greenland which the article is referring to. The Helheim Glacier is up here, Kulisuk is down here, and Tassilak is right across the bay. Fortunately, NOAA has an extremely good temperature record from Tassilak, the best one in Greenland. I've graphed out here every single summer daily maximum temperature at Tassilak, Greenland since 1898. NOAA has collected almost 11,000 summer daily maximum temperature readings at Tassilak. This is the trend line. You can see it's going down. It's declining at a rate of about 2.4 degrees Fahrenheit per century. Tassilak summers are getting cooler. The average daily maximum summer temperature at Tassilak, Greenland is 51 degrees Fahrenheit. That's just 1 degree cooler than the 52 degrees which Borenstein wants you to believe is unusual. This next graph shows all 4,675 summer days at Tassilak, Greenland since 1898, which were warmer than 52 degrees. During the summer of 1897, Tassilak reached 77 degrees Fahrenheit. Then in 1916 it reached 78 degrees, and has reached 78 degrees several other times since then. Borenstein is trying to mislead his readers into believing that 52 degrees is unusual, when in fact it's just about average, and temperatures have actually been declining in that region for well over a century. And Tassilak is the only station in Greenland which NOAA has a long-term daily temperature record for. This next graph shows the average daily maximum temperature at Tassilak, Greenland since 1898 for the entire year. The blue dots represent the average annual maximum temperature, and the red line is the 5-year mean. You can see that temperatures now are just about as warm as they were prior to 1960, and that there was a very cold period from about 1960 until about the year 2000. Climate alarmists almost always start their temperature and ice records for the Arctic right around 1979. It's not a coincidence that this was the coldest years on record there. By starting their trend at the coldest year on record, it's very easy to make it look like the Arctic is warming up and the ice is melting. But what these scientists and journalists are doing isn't science, it's just fraud. Speaking of fraud, let's go back to the article. The ice Holland is standing on is thousands of years old. Scientists say it'll be gone within a year or two, adding yet more water to rising seas worldwide. Holland is standing on the terminus of a glacier. Glaciers are rivers of ice. They flow from the mountains to the sea. This is what glaciers are supposed to do. It's like standing at the mouth of a river and crying over the fact that the water is flowing into the sea. It makes no sense scientifically. I'm going to step away from Borenstein's article for a minute for a little bit of comic relief. This is a recent article from The New Yorker, Climate Change in the Giant Iceberg Off Greenland Shore by Carolyn Corman. And there's a picture of a giant iceberg off Greenland shore. For climate alarmists, a giant iceberg is an indication of climate change. But icebergs are exactly what's supposed to happen at the mouth of a glacier. Big chunks of ice break off of the glacier and float away in the sea. One of those giant chunks of ice sank the Titanic in 1912. Perhaps Carolyn Corman should get on Netflix and watch the movie Titanic again. But back to Borenstein. Summer this year is hitting Greenland hard with record-shattering heat and extreme melt. By season's end, about 440 billion tons of ice, maybe more, will have melted or calved off Greenland's giant ice sheet, experts estimate. That's enough to flood the entire state of Pennsylvania underwater about a foot deep. Let's put this in perspective. There's about 3,000 trillion tons of ice in Greenland. If Greenland lost 440 billion tons of ice every year, it would take more than 6,000 years for all of the ice to melt. But that number is nearly meaningless anyway. Now I'm going to show you why. This is a very simple drawing of the Greenland ice sheet from the Danish Meteorological Institute. The ice at Greenland is about 2 miles thick, and most of the surface is up near 10,000 feet elevation. At that high elevation and high latitude, much of the surface of Greenland rarely, if ever, gets above freezing. Greenland gets very large amounts of snow during their long winter, and only a small percentage of that can melt during their short summer. The fact that more snow falls on Greenland every year than melts is why the Greenland ice sheet is so thick. But the ice can't just keep piling up higher and higher until it reaches the top of the atmosphere. There has to be another mechanism to keep the ice at equilibrium. And what that mechanism is glaciers. This huge weight of ice in the middle of Greenland squeezes the ice down and forces it to flow away to the sea as glaciers. Then when the glacier gets to the sea, it breaks off and forms icebergs. When the icebergs form, reporters at the New Yorker stand there and cry. They think it's a sign of climate change. But actually it's just an essential mechanism needed to keep the ice at equilibrium. Like I said, otherwise it would just keep piling up higher and higher until it got to the top of the troposphere. Many climate alarmists claim that more ice is currently leaving Greenland via glacial calving than is accumulating on the surface. Measuring the total mass balance of Greenland is actually a very difficult measurement, and I don't really trust any of the numbers which these people are coming up with. But that's not really important anyway as far as climate is concerned. The amount of ice flowing away from the center of Greenland is a function of how much snow fell in the past, not at the present. If the accumulation on the surface started to slow down, then eventually the amount of ice flowing away would also slow down. Greenland will find an equilibrium one way or another. So what's important for Greenland climatically is the surface mass balance. That's the difference between how much snow falls on Greenland's surface every winter and how much melts off of the surface during the summer. The amount of glacial calving has far more to do with the past climate of Greenland than the current climate. Now we're going to look at the surface mass balance graphs from the Danish Meteorological Institute. The gray line shows the average from 1981 to 2010. On average, about 550 billion tons of snow falls on Greenland during their long winter, and then during their short summer, about 200 billion tons of that melts. The melt season is over this year in Greenland, and the net accumulation was about 160 billion tons of snow. That means about 160 billion tons more snow fell during the winter than melted during the summer. Climate alarmists were strangely silent during the previous 2 years when huge amounts of snow accumulated on Greenland's surface. During the year 2016-2017, about 540 billion tons of snow accumulated on the surface net, and during the year 2017-2018, about 500 billion tons of snow net accumulation occurred on Greenland's surface. So the total for the last 3 years is about 1.2 trillion tons of new snow accumulated on the surface of Greenland. The key point here is that a lot more snow falls on the surface of Greenland every year than can melt during their short summer. And if at present there actually is more ice flowing away from the center of the ice sheet than is accumulating on the surface, as climate alarmists claim, that's not a climatic event, and that eventually the amount of ice flowing away would slow down and would go back to equilibrium and Greenland would not disappear. Climate alarmists like Seth Borenstein are attempting to create fear. They want you to believe that you're going to burn up and drown. Journalists have been doing the same thing for a very long time. Here's an article from 85 years ago attempting to accomplish exactly the same purpose. Will melting icebergs engulf the world? And then they show the whole East Coast and Gulf Coast underwater. And here's a picture of the Empire State Building sticking out of deep water, which has drowned Manhattan. And if we go back to the 1930s at Tasselac, we can see those are actually some of the warmest years on record there. The 1934 scare story in the press is essentially identical to what journalists are doing today. New York and London could be underwater within decades. Scientists say devastating climate change will take place sooner than thought. There's their imaginary appeal to authority. Scientists say. Who are these scientists? Whoever they are, they should step out from the shadows and hold a public debate so they can be publicly humiliated. Now let's go back to Seth Borenstein's article. By season's end, about 440 billion tons of ice, maybe more, will have melted or calved off Greenland's ice sheet, experts estimate. That's enough to flood the entire state of Pennsylvania underwater about a foot deep. Let's think about that for a minute. Most of what melts off of Greenland's surface during the summer is snow, not ice, and if you think about how much precipitation falls on Pennsylvania every year, it's enough to flood the state underwater about 3 feet deep. This is a completely meaningless statement. And if we go back up to the top of the page and read that again, the ice Holland is standing on is thousands of years old. Scientists say it will be gone within a year or two, adding yet more water to rising seas worldwide. That's exactly what glaciers do. The snow accumulates in the center and eventually flows out to the sea and melts. But what Borenstein is failing to mention is all of that huge amounts of snow which accumulates in Greenland during the winter, all evaporated back out of the seas. There's an equilibrium going on here which he's not discussing. Melting ice returns water to the sea, raising sea level, but precipitation came from evaporated seawater which lowered sea level. I normally describe climate alarmists as being like bad gamblers. They only remember their wins, but forget about their losses, which are usually much more common and much larger. Now let's go down to the bottom of this page. Between July 31st and August 3rd alone, more than 58 billion tons melted from the surface. The average for this time of year is less than 18 billion tons. This is complete nonsense. Just from the surface mass balance, the average for this time of year is about 200 billion tons of snow melted since the peak earlier in the year. One can only imagine where Borenstein pulled this 18 billion tons number from. Now let's go on to Borenstein's claims on the next page. One of the places hit hardest this hot Greenland summer is on the southeastern edge of the giant frozen island. Helheim, one of Greenland's fastest retreating glaciers, has shrunk about 6 miles since scientists came here in 2005. Here's the Helheim Glacier, and here's Tassilak, which NOAA has an excellent temperature record for. Let's see if it was really hot there this summer. This graph shows temperatures at Tassilak this summer in red and 1916 in blue. You can see that in 1916, Tassilak had a lot of days over 70 degrees Fahrenheit. This summer only had one. The average summer maximum temperature in Tassilak is about 51 degrees Fahrenheit. This year was a little bit above average, but not quite as warm as 1916. Other than one warm day, it was not hot at Tassilak and not particularly unusual. One more fake claim from Borenstein. Now let's go look at his discussion about the retreat of the Helheim Glacier. These animated GIFs show changes at 2 Greenland glaciers since the year 2012. The Helheim Glacier flows to the east and has retreated about 1 mile since 2012. The glacier is a little less than 4 miles wide, so it's lost nearly 4 square miles of ice since 2012. On the right is the Petermann Glacier, which flows to the north. This glacier is much larger, it's about 10 miles wide, and it's advanced about 5 miles since 2012. So the amount of ice gain at the Petermann Glacier is actually about 10 times as large as the amount of ice lost at the Helheim Glacier. No surprise that Borenstein chose to talk about the relatively small ice loss at the Helheim Glacier and ignore the large gain at the Petermann Glacier. Several scientists, such as oceanographer Josh Willis of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, said what's happening is a result of both man-made climate change and natural but weird weather patterns. So the first question that comes to mind is, why is NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory talking about Greenland glaciers? Shouldn't they be focused on jet propulsion? And the second question is, why are they spreading complete nonsense? There is zero indication that what's going on in Greenland has anything to do with man-made climate change. If we go back 80 years, we can see that Greenland was melting back then. December 17, 1939, Rochester Democrat. Glaciers melting over Greenland. All the glaciers in eastern Greenland are rapidly melting, declared Professor Hans Ullmann, Swedish geologist, in a report to the Geographical Society here on his recent expedition to the Arctic subcontinent. Everything points to the fact that the climate in that region has been growing warmer during recent years, the professor said. It may without exaggeration be said that the glaciers, like those in Norway, face the possibility of a catastrophic collapse. The Helheim Glacier is located in eastern Greenland, so 80 years ago it was melting rapidly and facing the possibility of a catastrophic collapse. Well, obviously it didn't collapse back then. And if we look at the temperature record at Tasselak, we can see why. Eastern Greenland was very warm during the 1930s, and then it got very cold after the 1960s, and glaciers expanded a lot. So we can see that the climate of Greenland goes in cycles. It warmed to the 1930s, then it cooled rapidly in the 1960s and 70s, and then it warmed up again. But temperatures are no warmer now than they were in the 1930s. In fact, they're generally a little bit cooler. So there's zero indication that humans have had any impact on the climate. NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab should stick with what they're supposed to be doing and stop spreading mindless climate propaganda. Now let's look at Borenstein's next claim. Glaciers here do shrink in the summer and grow in the winter, but nothing like this year. Once again, Borenstein is talking complete gibberish. This animated GIF shows the Petermann Glacier every year since 2012. The glacier has been steadily growing year after year. The concept of it shrinking during the summer is absurd, and I'm going to show you why. This photograph is taken near the mouth of the Petermann Glacier. The glacier is very thick, about 100 feet thick. There's no way that ice could retreat during the summer. The glacier is actually advancing about 10 feet per day. Borenstein seems to imagine that you could melt more than 10 feet of ice off of a 100-foot thick glacier in one day. That's completely absurd. Now let's go to his next nonsensical claim. Summit Station, a research camp nearly 2 miles high and far north, warmed to above freezing this year for a record total of 16.5 hours. Before this year, that station was above zero for only 6.5 hours in 2012, once in 1889, and also in the Middle Ages. Borenstein probably should have done a little fact-checking. The Danish Meteorological Institute says that this claim simply isn't true. Was the record heat on the ice sheet last Friday? No. Quality checks have confirmed our assumption that the measurement was too high. The temperature at the summit was not above freezing either Thursday, August 1st or Friday, August 2nd. Borenstein is repeating fake claims which have been circulating among alarmists but have no basis in fact. Borenstein also claimed that the summit camp was in far north Greenland. Had he actually looked on a map, he would have seen that it's right in the center of Greenland. Then he claims, before this year, that station was above zero for only 6.5 hours in 2012, once in 1889, and also in the Middle Ages. According to NOAA, that station was above freezing on 5 days in 2012 and reached a peak of 35.1 degrees on July 12, 2012. So once again, Borenstein is probably spreading misinformation. But now when we get to the end of this paragraph, it gets very interesting. Why was it warm in 1889 and also in the Middle Ages? Here's an article from the New York Times from 85 years ago. New York Times, Monday, January 22, 1934. Changing climate indicated in Arctic. Professor Griggs traces fate of lost Norse colonies to increasing Greenland cold. Tree roots pierce bodies. They could not have grown in now perpetually frozen ground. So during the Middle Ages, when the Vikings lived there were trees growing in Greenland in places where it's too cold now for trees to grow. Carbon dioxide levels were very low during the Middle Ages, so obviously the warmth was not caused by greenhouse gases. And obviously Greenland's climate is not controlled by humans. Here's another article from 1947. Arctic phenomenon, warming of climate causes concern. The possibility of a prodigious rise in the surface of the ocean with resultant widespread inundation arising from an Arctic climatic phenomena was discussed yesterday by Dr. Hans Ullman, a noted Swedish geophysicist at the University of California Geophysical Institute. He said that temperature in the Arctic had increased 10 degrees Fahrenheit since 1900, an enormous rise from a scientific standpoint. The Arctic change is so serious that I hope an international agency can speedily be formed to study the conditions on a global basis, he added. He pointed out that whereas in 1910 the navigable season along western Spitsbergen lasted 3 months, it now lasted 8 months. So we know it was very warm in Greenland during the Middle Ages. We know it was very warm in Greenland during the 1930s and 1940s. So we know that Greenland's temperature is not controlled by carbon dioxide. It's not controlled by humans. So let's finish up with this ridiculous claim at the end of Borenstein's article. If you look at climate model projections, we can expect to see larger areas of the ice sheet experiencing melt for longer durations of the year and greater mass loss going forward, said University of Georgia ice scientist Tom Mode. There's every reason to believe that years that look like this will become more common. Actually, the historical record shows the exact opposite. There's no reason to believe that current temperatures have anything to do with climate change, and every reason to believe that it was just as warm in Greenland many times in the past. This year had one warm day near the Helheim Glacier, whereas in 1916 they had many warm days near the Helheim Glacier. Climate model projections are based on the theory that carbon dioxide controls the climate. Then they use these projections based on their own theories to prove their own theories. What they're doing would be the equivalent of a Catholic theologian using Catholic theology to prove Catholic theology. It makes no sense scientifically or logically what they're doing. If you make a model based on your own assumptions, you can't then use the results of that model to prove your own assumptions, because they're essentially the same thing. These climate models are the junk science which drives the CO2 endangerment finding and drives all this massive amount of junk science as we see in this Seth Borenstein article. It's no surprise that Seth Borenstein is writing this sort of junk. He's been doing it for decades. What is disturbing to me, though, is that a small group of scientists are willing participants in it. There's no indication that anything going on in Greenland isn't just cyclical behavior which has happened many times in the past. These prior warm periods in Greenland, like during the Middle Ages and in the 1930s, were at very low levels of CO2. So claims that carbon dioxide are the cause of the current warm period are not based on reality. These same claims of icebergs melting and cities drowning have been circulating around the press for many, many years. And then journalists point to perfectly ordinary events like icebergs calving off of glaciers as signs of climate change. They have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. So we know that these journalists are clowns, and we know that a small handful of scientists are their enablers. But the problem is that these people are trying to influence policy with their junk science, ignorance, and fraud. They need to be stopped before they can do any more damage. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.